Hi guys, welcome back to another video. Different surrounding right now because I'm on the phone with the government waiting to talk to them. And so if you hear a little bit of nice background music, elevator music, it's the government. And I'm sure you'll hear them saying, they'll chime in every now and then and say something about waiting and blah, 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 and filing your RSPs or doing this or that. Anyway, um, I'm representing my alma mater today. Um, okay, so today I'm going to talk about Augustine's Soliloquies. Okay, I'll provide a little bit of background. Uh, St. Augustine is my specialty. I wrote two of my graduate school theses on St. Augustine. I haven't talked about him really on this channel, but I will, I promise. I'll talk more and more about him. Um, it's funny. Somebody on Twitter asked what author you read the most of, and I immediately thought of Nietzsche and I thought of Tolstoy, and it took me a while to realize. Oh, and then I thought about Plato as well. Then I realized, no, Saint Augustine, definitely by far. Now, Saint Augustine lived from 354 to 430 AD. So Um, and he's most well known for his book called Confessions. And he wrote Confessions over a couple of years from, I think, basically 397 to 401. And he wrote a lot of other stuff. And a lot of his works have survived, um, like, you know, dozens of his works. And his most famous ones are Confessions, City of God, On the Trinity. Um, he began as a young man, he began as kind of like a philosopher type guy. He fell in love with philosophy after reading one of Cicero's works, and he really got a great love of that, and it really changed his life. And eventually, he became a Christian, like a Catholic Christian. Um, he had flirted with different things at the time. He lived in North Africa. He's from North Africa, best known at the time for the city of Carthage, which had been destroyed and then rebuilt by the Romans. He lived nearby Carthage, and he gets his title, Augustine of Hippo, from the town of Hippo Regius, which is like basically a little seaport town. So it's one of the more important of the North African towns, but the number one, of course, was Carthage. So we're quite far away from Egypt. Okay, so we're uh, basically in modern day Algeria. Hippo's in modern day Algeria, and I can't remember 100%, but Carthage might be in Tunisia. I can't remember. Anyway, so that's the type of thing you're thinking about. And the time when Augustine was around, the Catholic Church had reached cultural hegemony. I don't know if hegemony is the right word, but came to dominate Roman culture over the maybe generation or two before Augustine, especially starting with the conversion of Emperor Constantine in about 300. So we're looking about a century before Augustine, a little bit less than a century, and eventually, gradually, things started turning towards Catholic Church's domination of Roman culture. But it was a little bit different in North Africa. There was a group called the Donatists who were predominant. And the difference between the Donatists and the Catholics was that the Donatists didn't accept reconversion. So, what I mean is that they were very rigoristic. And, for instance, in the persecutions, like the Diocletian persecution a few generations earlier, if people, surrendered their Catholicism or their Christianity and offered sacrifice to the pagan gods, then and then later wanted to come back to the church, the Donatists said no, that wasn't possible. Whereas the Catholics um, were a little bit more forgiving in that regard. we have to remember that there was no coherent um, doctrine of confession at the time. In this day and age, you can go to confession, and with serious contrition and penance, you can become a Catholic again in good standing. That wasn't so in the early church, and so this is the time that, and Augustine was one of the real people, one of the real theorists of all these ideas that would fuel the church's idea of sacraments, especially the sacrament of confession, sacrament of baptism, and of communion, and so on. So anyway, the Donatists were the biggest group in North Africa, in Western North Africa, I should say. I could give you the Roman provincial names, but why bother? Um, so Augustine had a lot of trouble with those guys because remember, as a convert, a guy who flirted with paganism and flirted with Manichaeism and other religion before his conversion, he was looked very suspiciously by the mainstream Donatists, and I think this is one of the biggest reasons why um, Augustine wrote his work Confessions, basically explaining his life, showing legitimacy for his conversion and all that stuff. Anyway, I'll talk more about that in future videos, maybe if I talk about confessions or whatever. So, Soliloquies, we're going back 10 years before Augustine wrote Confessions. Augustine was a priest when he wrote Confessions, and very soon to be, I guess he was a bishop, or bishop and priest during that time. But when he wrote Soliloquies 10 years earlier, he was basically going through the Easter mysteries, so basically the conversion process. Um, and this was going on in North Italy, actually. The only time he left Africa was as a young man trying to gain fame and gain a higher position in Roman government before his conversion. And that's when he met, for instance, St. Ambrose. And St. Ambrose is actually the one who baptized St. Augustine, which was good in his argument against the Donatists because St. Ambrose had a very good reputation. Um, so, anyway, picture Augustine in a country retreat leading up to his baptism at Easter. All baptisms were at Easter in those days. And picture him with his close friends, his intellectual friends, and they're having conversations, they're praying, they're discussing, and they're thinking. So Augustine wrote a few of his earliest works at that point. Um, those works are called generally the Cassisiacum dialogues. So they're dialogues based upon Cicero's kind of works, and Augustine is working. He's contemplating some pretty mainstream, or I should say, big subjects in terms of philosophy and Christianity, like the soul's immortality, stuff like that. Um, and so those are the Cassisiacum dialogues. And Soliloquies was written around that time, I think just after the dialogues. And Soliloquies, as if you can tell by the title, means a conversation with himself, right? You think of the famous soliloquies of in Shakespeare, like Hamlet's soliloquy, to be or not to be, that is the question. Um, it's funny because Augustine does say in this book itself, he says, basically, I invented the word soliloquy and I've invented this kind of work. And so there you go. I mean, it's if you're wondering like where the term came from, well, Augustine invented it. So Augustine invented a lot of things, and there you go. He invented the soliloquy too. So one thing you have to, so the basic framework of soliloquies is that it's a conversation between himself and reason. So basically, um, he's having a conversation with himself, kind of thing. So the stated the stated goal of this conversation, and it's over two books. Okay, there's book one and book two in here, and the whole thing, if you take out introductory material, table of contents, and indexes, is I'm guessing like 80 pages. So it's not that long. The first book is, say, about 30, 35 pages, and the second book is the rest, what, 45, 50 pages, whatever. Um, and the first book is more introductory. It includes a very beautiful long prayer to God, and it talks about basically how and why we should reason and open ourselves up to God's instruction. And the second book is really the bones of the argument that Augustine's trying to make. And again, as I said, the goal of the dialogue, I should say, of the monologue, is to prove the soul's immortality. Okay, he wrote another book about this as well, right after this one, called On the Soul's Immortality, which is a bit longer and a bit more technical, I suppose, if you want to call it that. Um, so what's interesting here, and the reason why I've read it just now is from my work on writing and reading, the project that I've told you about many times that I'm working on. And Augustine plays a very considerable role in the development of the theory of writing. As I said, like there's two great theorists, I think, of writing, and this is my theory in the ancient world. And the first is Plato, of course, and the second is Augustine. Okay, and Augustine, in several of his works, is very explicit, very conscious of this question about the meaning or the metaphysics of writing and reading and all that stuff. So he's such a valuable source for this stuff. So that's why I read Soliloquies. There's a couple more works of Augustine's that I need to reread to put in the chapter on Augustine. One is on the harmony of the Gospels, where he talks, for instance, about why Jesus never wrote anything. Okay, so on the harmony of Gospels, where Augustine brings up that important question. And I'd say most importantly, his on Christian doctrine, which is his really important work about how to interpret the Bible and how to teach the Bible and different considerations about that. And it's a really important look into his idea of reading the Bible, of how we communicate and all that stuff, and of course confessions. Now, Soliloquies is often called the early confessions, or the first confessions, or the confessions prototype, or something. And that's kind of true to a certain extent, but it's not very autobiographical. The first book has a bit more autobiography than the second book. And you can see some of the themes and some of the parallels between the two works. But Confessions is much more elaborate. It's, 4 or 5 times longer and more detailed. And Confessions certainly elaborates on many of the themes brought up in Soliloquies. Okay, Soliloquies, what do I think of it? It's a beautiful little book. It's the first book is very warm, very, and the second book carries you through the more of the technical aspects of Augustine's argument. Now, the premises are very Platonic, and the dialogue is very Platonic, and the argument is very Platonic. So I'm trying to think of a certain word that would define the kind of reasoning he makes here. I think something like an ontological break or nominalism and realism. I think all that plays a part in here, but I don't want to throw out these words too casually because I don't know if I'm speaking of them in the best way. So, Augustine's premises are that he can only be happy if he knows the truth. And without knowing the truth, he won't be happy. And there's certain things, and I think we can all identify with this and agree with this, is that if certain things aren't true, then how can we be happy? And if the soul, Augustine says, if the soul is not immortal, how can I be happy? He takes the existence of God for granted, and he takes the Socratic the Socratic equation that knowledge equals happiness for granted as well. And I mean, I agree with that, that part. So towards the end, we see as they reach a kind of more definite position that, yes, indeed, the soul is immortal, the soul has to be immortal. And Augustine, and this is proven. I'm not partial to the proof. It's one that Plato's exercised many times. And I can't help but think about John Locke that I recently read. So anyway, so this is the point of the book. He tries to prove the soul's existence so he can be happy.
So it's the old Platonic kind of argument where, because ideas are bigger than experience, then it has to point something to something bigger than our experience in the world. So how do we have ideas of things that, like Plato would call universals, when we have never experienced that universal? Now, Plato used that as proof of the immortality of the soul and the existence of these forms and of pre-existence. Augustine, in this work, Soliloquies, he uses it to prove the immortality of the soul. One of the questions that scholars debate is whether, as with Plato, the immortality of the soul goes in both directions. So Plato said it does go in both directions, and of course, there we have reincarnation and pre-existence. I'm pretty sure, and I'll put the excerpt up here that's to the point. I'm pretty sure that Augustine does what he can to say, yeah, the soul is immortal, but he doesn't want to say there's pre-existence. Okay, so he steers a very careful line without committing himself to the question. And you'll notice that what he says does come short of saying that there is pre-existence. It'd be very difficult for a Christian to maintain pre-existence. Someone like Origen, I believe, the 3rd century great Christian theologian, he seems to have believed in pre-existence, but that idea had been condemned quite solidly by Augustine's time. So Augustine's very careful, even as just around the time of his baptism, he's pretty sure that Christians don't believe in pre-existence. Nevertheless, as he states here, the soul, the ideas that the soul contains are bigger than experience makes possible. Therefore, the soul transcends our experience. I suppose you put that in so many words. So anyway, there's lots in this short work that's definitely worth attending to if you're interested in Augustine, or if you're interested in how people in his time thought, and how, like the philosophers, how they conducted themselves. And I mean, this work is as good an introduction to ancient philosophical discussion as any other. I mean, you could go with Plato, or you could go with Cicero, or you could go with this one from Augustine. So anyway, it's a very it's not all that difficult to work, and it's brief enough not to get you bogged down in things. So anyway, thanks so much for listening, guys, and we'll be back with some other reviews really soon. Thank you.